Darwin's theory of evolution. Charles Darwin did not set out to change how humanity understood itself. In the early 19th century, he was a young naturalist, quietly observing plants, animals, and geological formations during a long voyage aboard the HMS Beagle. What began as careful note-taking gradually became a framework that would reshape biology, philosophy, and culture, not through sudden upheaval, but through slow, persistent influence. During his travels, Darwin noticed patterns that seemed easy to ignore but impossible to forget. Species that lived close to one another often shared similarities, yet differed in subtle ways depending on their environment. On the Galapagos Islands, finches displayed variations in beak shape that corresponded precisely to the food sources available on each island. These observations suggested that species were not fixed creations, but adaptable populations shaped by their surroundings over time. Darwin proposed a simple yet powerful idea. Individuals within a species vary, some variations offer advantages, and those advantages increase the chances of survival and reproduction. Over many generations, these small differences accumulate. This process, which he called natural selection, required no guiding hand and no sudden transformations. It worked quietly, continuously, and relentlessly. When On the Origin of Species was published in 1859, its immediate impact was debated, criticized, and often misunderstood. Yet the theory did not spread through dramatic confrontation alone. Instead, it gradually integrated itself into scientific thinking. Biologists found that evolution explained fossil records, geographical distribution of species, and anatomical similarities far better than existing models. Over time, it became the unifying principle of the life sciences. The influence of Darwin's theory extended far beyond biology. It subtly altered how humanity perceived progress, change, and time itself. Life was no longer seen as static but dynamic. Nature became a system governed by gradual processes rather than sudden acts. This shift influenced geology, anthropology, and later genetics, even before the molecular mechanisms of inheritance were understood. Importantly, Darwin's theory did not offer comfort or moral instruction. It described a world driven by adaptation, not intention. This neutrality made it both powerful and unsettling. It challenged long-held assumptions without directly attacking them, allowing the idea to spread through evidence rather than ideology. In medicine, evolutionary thinking reshaped the understanding of disease resistance, adaptation, and variation within populations. In ecology, it provided a framework for understanding balance, competition, and extinction. Even in everyday language, evolutionary metaphors quietly entered discussions about culture, technology, and social change. Darwin himself was cautious. He delayed publishing his ideas for years, aware of their implications. Yet once released, the theory required little defense from its creator. It endured because it explained the natural world with clarity, patience, and restraint. Darwin's theory of evolution did not dominate the world overnight. It did something far more enduring. It settled into the foundations of modern thought, shaping how humanity understands life, not through force but through time. The germ theory of disease. For most of human history, disease was understood as something vague and intangible. Illness was blamed on bad air, divine punishment, imbalanced bodily fluids, or invisible vapors drifting through crowded streets. These explanations were not careless guesses. They were logical within the limits of the knowledge available at the time. For centuries, medicine advanced slowly, restrained by the absence of a clear cause behind infection and decay. The foundations of the germ theory of disease were laid quietly, through observation rather than revolution. In the 17th century, early microscopes revealed a hidden world of tiny organisms, but their significance remained unclear. These animalcules, as they were called, were curiosities rather than suspects. No direct link between microorganisms and illness could yet be proven. The turning point began in the 19th century, when rapid urbanization made disease impossible to ignore. Cities expanded faster than sanitation systems, and epidemics of cholera, tuberculosis, and typhoid swept through populations with alarming regularity. Traditional explanations failed to prevent their spread. Patterns began to emerge. Disease followed contaminated water, unclean instruments, and overcrowded conditions. One of the earliest quiet breakthroughs came from Ignaz Semmelweis, a Hungarian physician working in maternity wards. He noticed that women treated by doctors who had recently performed autopsies were far more likely to die from puerperal fever than those treated by midwives. His solution was simple: hand-washing with disinfectant. Mortality rates dropped dramatically. Yet Semmelweis could not explain why this worked, and his ideas were largely dismissed. The theoretical framework arrived later through the work of Louis Pasteur. Pasteur demonstrated that microorganisms were responsible for fermentation and spoilage, overturning the belief in spontaneous generation. If microbes could sour wine and milk, it followed logically that they could also affect living bodies. This idea connected countless isolated observations into a coherent explanation. Robert Koch further refined the theory by identifying specific microorganisms responsible for specific diseases. His work established clear criteria linking germs to illness, transforming suspicion into evidence. Disease was no longer an abstract imbalance. It had identifiable, observable causes. The germ theory did not spread through dramatic confrontation with tradition. Instead, it proved itself through results. Surgical mortality declined once instruments were sterilized. Infections decreased when water supplies were cleaned. Hospitals became places of healing rather than centers of contagion. These improvements spoke louder than philosophical debates. Over time, the theory reshaped medicine at every level. Hygiene became a scientific necessity rather than a moral suggestion. Public health systems emerged, focusing on prevention instead of reaction. Vaccination programs, antiseptics, and antibiotics all relied on the foundational idea that microscopic organisms could be controlled. Beyond medicine, the germ theory quietly influenced daily life. Clean drinking water, food safety standards, waste management, and personal hygiene practices became embedded in modern society. Actions as simple as washing hands or covering wounds gained meaning grounded in invisible biological processes. Perhaps the most profound influence of the germ theory was conceptual. It changed how humans understood causality. Illness was no longer mysterious or inevitable. It followed physical rules and could be studied, predicted, and prevented. This shift encouraged trust in empirical observation and experimentation, reinforcing the scientific method itself. The theory also introduced a new awareness of interconnectedness. Individual actions could influence collective health. An unseen organism passing from one host to another could alter the fate of entire cities. This understanding laid the groundwork for modern epidemiology and risk management, even when the language surrounding it remained understated. The germ theory of disease did not announce itself as a revolution. It worked silently, improving outcomes one sterilized instrument, one clean water source, one prevented infection at a time. Its power lay not in spectacle, but in consistency. Today, its influence is so deeply embedded that it feels invisible. Modern medicine operates within its assumptions automatically. Yet this quiet theory reshaped human survival itself, extending life expectancy and redefining what it meant to protect health, all by revealing that the smallest forms of life could wield the greatest impact. Newton's laws of motion. In the late 17th century, the natural world was still largely interpreted through intuition, tradition, and fragmented observation. Motion, in particular, was poorly understood. Objects moved because something pushed them, stopped because something slowed them, and fell because it was their nature to do so. These explanations felt sufficient in everyday life, yet they failed to describe the universe with precision. Into this uncertainty stepped Isaac Newton, not with dramatic declarations, but with a framework that would quietly organize reality itself. Newton's work emerged during a period of intense intellectual curiosity. Astronomy had revealed that planets moved in predictable paths, yet no universal explanation connected celestial motion with the behavior of objects on Earth. Newton approached this gap methodically. Rather than describing individual phenomena, he sought rules that applied everywhere, at all times, without exception. His 3 laws of motion, published in Philosophiae Naturalis Principia Mathematica in 1687, were deceptively simple. The first law stated that an object remains at rest or in uniform motion unless acted upon by an external force. This idea challenged centuries of belief by suggesting that motion did not require constant cause, only change did. Rest and motion were no longer opposites. They were states governed by the same principle. The second law introduced a precise relationship between force, mass, and acceleration. For the first time, motion could be calculated rather than guessed. This transformed movement into something measurable, predictable, and repeatable. The physical world became a system that could be expressed mathematically, reducing chaos to clarity. The third law described interaction itself. For every action, there is an equal and opposite reaction. This principle revealed that forces never occur in isolation. Every push creates a counterpush. Every motion is part of a mutual exchange. Nature, under this view, was not a collection of independent events but a network of balanced interactions. What made Newton's laws quietly powerful was not just their accuracy, but their universality. The same rules that governed a falling apple also described the motion of planets and stars. This unification dissolved the boundary between Earth and the heavens. The universe became a single, coherent system operating under shared principles. The influence of Newton's laws unfolded gradually. Engineers adopted them to design structures that could withstand forces rather than collapse under them. Architects learned to distribute weight with mathematical confidence. Navigation improved as motion could be calculated over distance and time. Artillery, mechanics, and transportation all became more precise, not through trial and error, but through prediction. Over time, these laws shaped the mindset of entire disciplines. Physics became a science of equations rather than descriptions. The idea that nature obeys consistent, discoverable rules encouraged generations of thinkers to seek order beneath complexity. This perspective extended beyond science into philosophy, reinforcing the belief that the universe operates according to rational principles rather than hidden whims. Importantly, Newton's laws did not require constant reference to their creator. Once established, they stood independently, quietly embedded in education, industry, and daily life. Children learned them in classrooms without considering their origin. Machines operated under their logic without acknowledgement. Their presence became so fundamental that it faded into the background of thought. Even as later theories expanded and refined the understanding of motion, Newton's framework remained essential. Within everyday scales of speed and size, his laws continued to describe reality with remarkable accuracy. They became the default language for motion, force, and balance. Perhaps the most enduring influence of Newton's laws of motion was psychological rather than mechanical. They taught humanity that the world is not merely observed, but understandable. That beneath the apparent randomness of movement lies structure. That complexity can emerge from simple rules applied consistently. Newton did not simply explain motion. He provided a way of thinking about the physical world that emphasized predictability, balance, and cause. His laws did not announce a revolution with noise or spectacle. They settled into the foundations of modern civilization, quietly guiding everything that moves. The theory of relativity. At the beginning of the 20th century, physics appeared nearly complete. The laws of motion formulated by Newton had described the behavior of objects with remarkable precision for more than 2 centuries. Time was assumed to flow uniformly, space was considered fixed and absolute, and gravity acted as an invisible force pulling masses toward one another. These ideas worked so well in everyday experience that few questioned their limits. Yet subtle inconsistencies began to appear, suggesting that the foundations of reality were more flexible than previously believed. Albert Einstein approached these problems not through new instruments, but through careful reasoning. He examined the assumptions underlying classical physics and asked whether they truly reflected how nature behaves. In 1905, he introduced the theory now known as special relativity, based on 2 principles. The laws of physics are the same for all observers moving at constant speeds, and the speed of light is constant regardless of the motion of the observer. These ideas were simple in form, yet their implications were profound. Special relativity revealed that time and space are not independent. The passage of time depends on motion. Clocks moving at high speeds tick more slowly relative to those at rest. Distances contract in the direction of motion. Events that appear simultaneous to one observer may not be simultaneous to another. These effects are not illusions or measurement errors, but fundamental properties of reality. Time itself became a variable rather than a universal constant. A decade later, Einstein extended these ideas with general relativity, a theory that redefined gravity. Instead of describing gravity as a force acting at a distance, he proposed that mass and energy curve spacetime itself. Objects move along paths shaped by this curvature, giving the appearance of attraction. Space and time were no longer passive stages on which events unfolded. They became active participants in the structure of the universe. The acceptance of relativity was gradual. Its predictions were subtle and often impossible to observe directly with early technology. However, key confirmations arrived through careful observation. The bending of light around massive objects, shifts in planetary orbits, and the precise behavior of time in gravitational fields all aligned with Einstein's equations. Each confirmation reinforced the theory without dramatic confrontation, allowing it to integrate quietly into scientific understanding. The influence of relativity extended far beyond theoretical physics. It reshaped cosmology, providing the framework for understanding black holes, gravitational waves, and the large-scale structure of the universe. It altered how scientists thought about beginnings, endings, and the evolution of cosmic systems. Space was no longer empty. It had geometry, texture, and limits shaped by energy and mass. In practical terms, relativity became embedded in modern technology. Satellite-based navigation systems rely on precise timekeeping that must account for relativistic effects caused by both speed and gravity. Without these corrections, positional errors would accumulate rapidly. What once seemed abstract became quietly essential to everyday life. Relativity also influenced the scientific mindset. It demonstrated that deeply held assumptions could be revised without invalidating previous knowledge. Newton's laws were not wrong. They were approximations within a broader framework. This layered understanding encouraged humility in science, reinforcing the idea that truth can be refined rather than replaced. Perhaps the most subtle impact of the theory of relativity was philosophical. It challenged intuitive notions of absolute time, fixed space, and objective simultaneity. Reality became dependent on perspective, yet governed by precise mathematical rules. This balance between relativity and order reshaped how knowledge itself was understood. Einstein's work did not spread through spectacle or authority. Its influence grew because it consistently matched observation and extended understanding where older models failed. Over time, relativity became inseparable from modern physics, not as a dramatic disruption, but as a quiet restructuring of the universe's foundations. The theory of relativity did not merely adjust equations. It altered humanity's relationship with time, space, and gravity, revealing a universe far more interconnected and dynamic than previously imagined. The unconscious mind. At the turn of the 20th century, the human mind was widely believed to be a rational, self-aware system. Thoughts, emotions, and decisions were assumed to arise from conscious intention. When behavior appeared irrational, it was often attributed to weakness, morality, or lack of discipline. This view placed consciousness at the center of human identity, leaving little room for hidden processes. Sigmund Freud quietly unsettled this assumption by proposing that much of mental life operates beyond conscious awareness. Freud's ideas did not emerge in isolation. Trained as a neurologist, he initially sought biological explanations for psychological symptoms. While treating patients suffering from hysteria and unexplained physical conditions, he observed a consistent pattern. Symptoms often lacked a clear physiological cause, yet responded to psychological exploration. This suggested that experiences, memories, and emotions could influence the body without entering conscious thought. The concept of the unconscious mind proposed that thoughts and desires could exist outside awareness while still shaping behavior. According to Freud, the mind was structured in layers. Conscious thought represented only a small portion, while beneath it lay a vast reservoir of repressed memories, instincts, and unresolved conflicts. These hidden elements express themselves indirectly, through dreams, slips of the tongue, habits, and emotional reactions. Freud argued that the unconscious developed primarily through early life experiences. Events that were emotionally intense or socially unacceptable were not erased, but pushed out of awareness. This repression did not eliminate their influence. Instead, these experiences continued to shape personality, motivation, and emotional responses, often without the individual recognizing their source. To explore this hidden terrain, Freud developed methods such as free association and dream interpretation. Dreams, he believed, were not random images but symbolic expressions of unconscious desires. While the interpretations were complex and often controversial, the underlying idea remained consistent. The mind communicates with itself through indirect means. The influence of Freud's theory expanded gradually. It did not offer immediate cures or mechanical explanations. Instead, it introduced a new way of listening. Therapy became a process of uncovering meaning rather than correcting surface behavior. This approach reshaped clinical psychology and psychiatry, shifting focus from symptoms alone to inner experience. Beyond medicine, the concept of the unconscious mind quietly permeated culture. Literature, cinema, and art began to explore hidden motives and internal conflict. Characters were no longer driven solely by visible goals, but by buried fears and desires. Storytelling itself became more psychological, reflecting the belief that identity is layered and complex. In everyday life, Freud's ideas altered how people interpreted behavior. Actions were no longer taken purely at face value. Mistakes, preferences, and emotional reactions were seen as potentially meaningful rather than accidental. The language of repression, defense mechanisms, and inner conflict entered common usage, often detached from their original clinical context. The theory also influenced how society understood responsibility and self-control. Human behavior appeared less transparent and more constrained by internal forces. This perspective encouraged empathy, recognizing that individuals may not fully understand their own motivations. Freud's ideas were debated, revised, and challenged, yet the core concept of unconscious mental processes endured. Even approaches that rejected his conclusions accepted the premise that cognition extends beyond awareness. The mind was no longer seen as a single, unified voice, but as a system shaped by competing forces. The unconscious mind did not dominate through empirical certainty alone. Its power lay in offering a framework that explained the contradictions of human behavior. It accounted for why people act against their interests, repeat harmful patterns, and struggle with emotions they cannot name. Freud did not claim that the unconscious could be fully mastered. Instead, he suggested that understanding it could reduce its influence. This subtle shift changed how humanity related to its inner world, introducing depth where certainty once existed. The idea of the unconscious mind did not arrive loudly. It entered slowly, through clinical practice, cultural expression, and language itself. Over time, it reshaped how people understood thought, desire, and identity, revealing that the mind is far less visible than it appears. Game theory. For much of human history, decision-making was viewed as an individual act shaped by intuition, experience, or authority. Choices were explained through personality, instinct, or moral reasoning. What remained largely unexamined was the structure behind decisions made in the presence of others, situations where outcomes depended not only on one's own actions, but on the actions of multiple participants acting simultaneously or in sequence. Game theory emerged quietly as a way to describe these interactions with precision. The foundations of game theory were laid in the early 20th century, when mathematicians began to explore strategic behavior as a formal problem. Rather than focusing on psychology or ethics, they treated decisions as logical moves within defined systems. Each participant or player pursued their own interests under constraints, anticipating the choices of others. What mattered was not intention, but structure. A major turning point came in 1944 with the publication of Theory of Games and Economic Behavior by John von Neumann and Oscar Morgenstern. This work introduced a rigorous mathematical framework for analyzing competition, cooperation, and conflict. It demonstrated that many real-world situations, from markets to negotiations, could be understood as strategic games governed by rules, payoffs, and expectations. One of the most influential ideas within game theory was the concept of equilibrium. In such a state, no participant can improve their outcome by changing strategy alone. This idea revealed that stability does not require harmony or fairness, only mutual constraint. Systems could settle into predictable patterns even when outcomes were inefficient or undesirable. As the theory developed, it moved beyond abstract mathematics into practical application. Economists adopted game theory to analyze markets, pricing, and competition. It offered insight into why rational actors might make choices that appear counterproductive when viewed in isolation. Collective outcomes, it showed, often emerge from individual incentives rather than shared goals. The influence of game theory expanded significantly during the mid-20th century, particularly in the context of global conflict. Strategic interactions between nations, especially under conditions of uncertainty and risk, mirrored theoretical games. Concepts such as deterrence, escalation, and mutual restraint could be examined without reference to emotion or ideology. The theory provided a language for understanding balance in high-stakes environments. What made game theory quietly transformative was its neutrality. It did not prescribe how people should behave. It described how rational behavior unfolds within structured situations. This allowed it to be applied across disciplines without demanding moral agreement. Political science, biology, and sociology all found value in its abstractions. In evolutionary biology, game theory offered a way to explain cooperation and competition without invoking conscious planning. Strategies could emerge through repetition and selection rather than intention. Patterns of behavior became stable not because they were chosen, but because they endured. In everyday life, game theory influenced how institutions were designed. Auctions, contracts, voting systems, and negotiations increasingly reflected an understanding of incentives and strategic response. Rules were crafted not around ideal behavior, but around predictable reactions. Perhaps the most subtle impact of game theory was cognitive. It encouraged people to think relationally rather than individually. Decisions were no longer isolated acts, but moves within interconnected systems. Anticipation became as important as action. Understanding behavior required mapping possibilities rather than judging outcomes. Over time, game theory became embedded in the background of modern decision-making. Its terminology entered common language, often stripped of mathematical detail. Yet its influence remained structural, shaping how strategies were formed and evaluated. Game theory did not change the world by offering new values or ideologies. It changed the world by revealing patterns beneath interaction itself. By treating choice as a system rather than a moment, it quietly reshaped how humans understand competition, cooperation, and consequence. The Big Bang Theory. For most of human history, the universe was assumed to be eternal and unchanging. The stars appeared fixed, the night sky reliable and repetitive. While individual celestial bodies moved, the universe itself was often imagined as a stable backdrop without a beginning or an end. This assumption felt natural, reinforced by the limitations of observation and the apparent permanence of the heavens. The Big Bang Theory quietly overturned this view by suggesting that the universe itself has a history. The origins of the theory trace back to the early 20th century, when advances in astronomy began to reveal unexpected patterns. As telescopes improved, astronomers noticed that distant galaxies were moving away from Earth. Their light appeared stretched toward the red end of the spectrum, an effect later understood as redshift. This observation implied that space itself was expanding, carrying galaxies with it rather than flinging them through static space. One of the first to interpret this expansion as evidence of a cosmic beginning was Georges Lemaitre, a physicist and mathematician who proposed that the universe emerged from an extremely dense and hot initial state. His idea did not attract immediate attention, partly because it conflicted with the prevailing preference for a timeless universe. Yet it offered a logical explanation for expansion without requiring constant creation. The theory gained further support through careful measurement rather than dramatic revelation. Edwin Hubble's observations confirmed a consistent relationship between distance and recessional speed among galaxies. The farther a galaxy was, the faster it appeared to move away. This pattern suggested that expansion was uniform and ongoing, reinforcing the idea that the universe was once far smaller and denser than it is now. Over time, additional evidence accumulated. The discovery of cosmic microwave background radiation revealed a faint, uniform glow permeating space. This radiation matched predictions of leftover energy from an early, hot phase of the universe. It was not localized or directional, but evenly distributed, suggesting a shared origin for all cosmic structures. The Big Bang Theory did not describe an explosion in space, but an expansion of space itself. This distinction was subtle but essential. Matter, energy, time, and space emerged together, evolving from extreme density into increasing complexity. The theory offered a framework rather than a visual narrative, relying on mathematics and observation rather than imagery. Its influence extended beyond astronomy. Cosmology became a historical science, concerned not only with structure, but with origin and development. Questions about time gained new meaning, as time itself became part of the physical system rather than an external measure. The universe was no longer simply observed. It was understood as something that changed. The theory also influenced how scientists approached evidence. It demonstrated that indirect signals, faint radiation, spectral shifts, statistical patterns, could reveal profound truths about reality. Observation did not require proximity. It required interpretation grounded in theory. The Big Bang Theory integrated seamlessly with other areas of physics, guiding models of particle formation and early cosmic conditions. It did not resolve every question, nor did it attempt to. Its strength lay in its ability to connect diverse observations under a single, coherent narrative. Culturally, the idea of a cosmic beginning subtly reshaped perspective. The universe acquired a sense of temporality. Existence itself appeared finite and evolving rather than static and eternal. This shift influenced philosophical reflection without demanding philosophical conclusions. The Big Bang Theory was not embraced because it was dramatic. It was accepted because it worked. Its predictions matched observation repeatedly across independent lines of evidence. Over time, it became the standard framework for understanding cosmic history. Rather than loudly redefining the universe, the Big Bang Theory quietly introduced a timeline. It transformed the cosmos from a fixed stage into a dynamic process, revealing that even the largest structures known to humanity are shaped by change. The social contract. Long before modern governments, constitutions, or legal systems existed, human societies faced a fundamental problem: how individuals could live together without constant conflict. Authority was often justified through tradition, divine right, or sheer force. Power belonged to kings, tribes, or conquerors, and obedience was expected rather than explained. The idea that political authority might instead arise from an agreement among individuals developed slowly and quietly, eventually forming what became known as the social contract. The roots of the social contract can be traced to early modern Europe, a period marked by religious conflict, civil war, and the gradual weakening of absolute monarchy. Thinkers began to question whether power truly flowed from God or lineage, or whether it could be justified through reason. The social contract emerged not as a single doctrine, but as a shared framework for understanding political legitimacy. Thomas Hobbes was among the first to articulate this idea systematically. Writing in the aftermath of civil war, he described a hypothetical state of nature in which no central authority existed. In such a condition, life was insecure and unpredictable, dominated by fear and competition. To escape this instability, individuals would agree to surrender certain freedoms to a governing authority in exchange for security and order. Authority, in this view, was not sacred but constructed. Later thinkers refined and reshaped the concept. John Locke emphasized natural rights and limited government, arguing that individuals entered into social agreements to protect life, liberty, and property. Authority existed to serve these ends, and when it failed, it could be altered or replaced. This interpretation quietly shifted power away from rulers and toward the governed. Jean-Jacques Rousseau offered another perspective, focusing on collective will rather than individual protection. He argued that legitimate authority arose from the general will of the people, not from force or inheritance. Obedience to law under this framework was not submission to another person, but participation in a shared agreement. What unified these interpretations was a radical yet understated assumption. Political order was artificial. Governments were not inevitable features of nature, but systems built through consent, explicit or implicit. This idea did not immediately overthrow monarchies or dismantle empires. Instead, it slowly altered how authority was justified and discussed. The influence of the social contract spread through education, legal theory, and political debate. It shaped constitutional thinking by reframing citizens as participants rather than subjects. Laws were no longer seen solely as commands, but as mutual obligations binding both rulers and ruled. Over time, this framework influenced the development of representative institutions. Elections, legal limits on power, and written constitutions all reflected the assumption that authority must be grounded in agreement. Even systems that retained strong central control adopted the language of consent to legitimize themselves. The social contract also reshaped how responsibility was understood. Individuals were no longer merely controlled by law. They were considered contributors to social order. Rights and duties became intertwined, forming the basis of civic identity. Society itself appeared as a shared project rather than a fixed hierarchy. Importantly, the theory did not demand uniformity. Different societies interpreted the contract differently, emphasizing security, liberty, or collective decision-making. Its flexibility allowed it to adapt across cultures and historical contexts without losing its core logic. The social contract did not spread through sudden revolutions alone. Its deeper influence was gradual, altering assumptions rather than institutions overnight. Even where power remained concentrated, rulers increasingly felt compelled to justify authority in rational terms. Perhaps the most lasting impact of the social contract was conceptual. It normalized the idea that political systems could be evaluated, revised, and redesigned. Authority became something to be explained rather than accepted. This quiet shift transformed governance from destiny into design. The social contract did not promise perfect societies. It offered something more enduring. A framework for understanding why people accept rules, obey laws, and cooperate with strangers. By redefining power as an agreement rather than a given, it quietly reshaped the foundations of the modern political world. Evolutionary psychology. For much of modern history, human behavior was explained primarily through culture, upbringing, and conscious choice. Personality, preference, and social structure were treated as products of environment and learning. While biology was acknowledged as the foundation of the body, the mind was often considered separate, flexible, adaptive, and largely shaped by experience. Evolutionary psychology quietly challenged this separation by proposing that the human mind itself is an evolved system. The roots of evolutionary psychology lie in the broader acceptance of evolutionary theory. Once it became clear that physical traits developed through natural selection, some thinkers began to ask whether mental traits might follow similar principles. If vision, hearing, and physical endurance were shaped by survival pressures, it seemed reasonable that cognition, emotion, and social behavior might also carry evolutionary traces. The formal development of evolutionary psychology occurred in the late 20th century, drawing from biology, psychology, and anthropology. Rather than focusing on surface behavior, the field sought to identify underlying cognitive mechanisms that evolved to solve recurring problems faced by ancestral humans. These problems included finding food, avoiding danger, forming alliances, selecting mates, and raising offspring. A central assumption of evolutionary psychology is that the human brain did not evolve for modern environments, but for conditions that existed over long periods of human prehistory. Many psychological tendencies, therefore, reflect adaptations to past challenges rather than present realities. Preferences, fears, and social instincts may appear irrational in contemporary contexts, yet they once increased survival or reproductive success. This perspective offered new explanations for universal patterns in human behavior. Emotional responses such as fear, jealousy, and attachment were interpreted not merely as cultural constructs, but as evolved strategies. Social behaviors, including cooperation and competition, could be understood as outcomes of long-term selective pressures rather than conscious planning. Evolutionary psychology also emphasized modularity, the idea that the mind consists of specialized systems rather than a single general-purpose processor. Different cognitive mechanisms evolved to address different challenges. This view contrasted with earlier models that treated intelligence as a unified capacity shaped primarily by learning. The influence of this theory spread gradually, often through reinterpretation rather than replacement. Existing psychological findings were revisited through an evolutionary lens. Patterns that once appeared arbitrary gained coherence when framed as adaptive responses. The theory did not dismiss culture, but positioned it as interacting with deeper biological tendencies. Beyond academia, evolutionary psychology quietly influenced how people understood themselves. Discussions of relationships, attraction, and social dynamics increasingly referenced evolutionary explanations. Human behavior appeared less random and more patterned, shaped by forces operating over vast timescales. The theory also affected research methods. Hypotheses were grounded in evolutionary logic, emphasizing function and origin rather than description alone. This encouraged interdisciplinary collaboration, linking psychology with genetics, archaeology, and behavioral ecology. Importantly, evolutionary psychology did not argue that behavior is fixed or inevitable. Instead, it proposed that inherited tendencies interact with environment, producing flexibility within constraint. Understanding these tendencies could clarify why certain behaviors are widespread without implying that they are unchangeable. The broader impact of evolutionary psychology was conceptual. It reframed the mind as a biological system with history. Thoughts, emotions, and social instincts became part of humanity's evolutionary narrative rather than separate from it. This shift altered how human nature itself was discussed. Rather than viewing behavior solely through moral or cultural lenses, it became possible to examine it as an outcome of adaptation. Responsibility, choice, and self-awareness remained central, but they existed within an inherited framework. Evolutionary psychology did not transform society through policy or ideology. Its influence was quieter, shaping interpretation rather than instruction. By placing the mind within the evolutionary process, it expanded understanding of why humans think, feel, and act as they do, revealing continuity between biology and behavior across deep time. The butterfly effect. For centuries, scientific thinking was dominated by the belief that the universe was fundamentally predictable. If all variables were known, outcomes could be calculated with precision. This assumption fit well with classical physics, where motion followed clear laws and small changes produced proportionally small effects. The butterfly effect quietly disrupted this certainty by revealing that some systems are exquisitely sensitive to initial conditions, making long-term prediction inherently limited. The concept emerged from the field of meteorology in the mid-20th century. Edward Lorenz, a mathematician and weather scientist, was working with early computer models designed to simulate atmospheric behavior. During one experiment, he restarted a simulation using rounded-off numbers, assuming the difference would be negligible. Instead, the model produced dramatically different results. A minuscule change in initial input led to a completely altered outcome. This observation challenged the assumption that precision alone guarantees predictability. Lorenz realized that in certain complex systems, tiny variations can amplify over time, leading to large-scale divergence. The metaphor he later used, the idea that the flap of a butterfly's wings could influence distant weather patterns, was not meant to be literal. It was a way of illustrating how sensitive such systems are to initial conditions. The butterfly effect became a central idea within chaos theory, a field that studies systems governed by deterministic rules yet capable of producing unpredictable behavior. These systems are not random. They follow strict laws. However, their sensitivity means that perfect measurement is required for accurate prediction, a requirement that cannot be met in practice. The influence of this idea extended beyond meteorology. It altered how scientists approached complex systems in physics, biology, economics, and ecology. In these domains, long-term forecasting became less about exact prediction and more about understanding patterns, ranges, and probabilities. Control gave way to management. The butterfly effect also reshaped scientific humility. It demonstrated that uncertainty does not necessarily arise from ignorance of laws, but from the nature of systems themselves. Even with complete knowledge of governing equations, outcomes may remain unpredictable due to sensitivity to conditions that cannot be measured with infinite precision. In practical terms, this insight influenced how models were constructed and interpreted. Rather than expecting single outcomes, scientists began to consider ensembles of possibilities. Risk assessment and scenario planning became more important than precise forecasts. This shift quietly changed decision-making in fields that rely on prediction. Beyond science, the butterfly effect entered broader cultural awareness. It offered a framework for understanding how small actions can lead to significant consequences without implying direct control. This perspective emphasized interconnectedness rather than causality in isolation. Importantly, the butterfly effect did not suggest that everything is chaotic or unknowable. It applied to specific types of systems, those that are nonlinear and sensitive. Many processes remain stable and predictable. The theory refined understanding rather than undermined it, identifying the boundaries of certainty. The idea also influenced philosophical perspectives on determinism and free will. If outcomes depend on imperceptible differences, then predictability becomes a matter of scale rather than principle. The future is shaped by structure, but not fully visible in advance. The butterfly effect did not arrive as a grand theory with sweeping claims. It emerged from a technical observation, quietly revealing a limitation within established models. Over time, its implications spread, altering how complexity itself was understood. By showing that small causes can lead to large effects without violating physical laws, the butterfly effect transformed assumptions about control, prediction, and responsibility. It introduced a subtle shift in worldview, reminding humanity that within complex systems, certainty fades not because rules fail, but because sensitivity prevails. The placebo effect. For much of medical history, healing was associated as much with belief as with treatment. Long before the development of modern pharmaceuticals, physicians relied on rituals, reassurance, and the authority of their role. Patients often improved even when remedies had little or no physiological activity. For centuries, these outcomes were attributed to coincidence, misdiagnosis, or the natural course of illness. The placebo effect quietly revealed that expectation itself could become a powerful biological factor. The term placebo originally referred to treatments given more to comfort than to cure. These interventions were not intended to deceive maliciously, but to provide hope when few options existed. Over time, as medicine became more scientific, such effects were treated as noise, psychological interference that needed to be eliminated from clinical observation. The turning point came when researchers began to notice consistent patterns. Patients who believed they were receiving effective treatment often reported reduced pain, improved mood, and measurable changes in physical symptoms, even when the treatment was inactive. These effects were not isolated or rare. They appeared repeatedly across conditions, cultures, and settings. As clinical trials became more rigorous, placebo-controlled studies were introduced to separate the effects of a drug from the effects of belief. Ironically, this effort to remove placebo responses brought them into clearer focus. It became evident that the placebo response was not imaginary. It produced observable changes in physiology, including alterations in heart rate, hormone levels, and neural activity. The placebo effect demonstrated that the brain does not merely interpret bodily signals. It actively participates in regulating them. Expectations, shaped by context, authority, and prior experience, can influence how the body processes pain, stress, and recovery. This insight blurred the boundary between mind and body, revealing them as deeply interconnected systems. Neuroscientific research later showed that placebo responses are associated with specific brain mechanisms. The release of endogenous chemicals, such as endorphins and dopamine, could be triggered by belief alone. These substances affect pain perception, mood, and motivation in ways comparable to pharmacological agents. The body, in effect, could generate its own internal medicine under certain conditions. The influence of the placebo effect extended beyond pain management. Studies documented placebo responses in conditions ranging from depression to Parkinson's disease. In some cases, Measurable motor or biochemical changes occurred despite the absence of active treatment. These findings challenged the assumption that psychological influence was superficial or secondary. Importantly, the placebo effect did not imply that diseases are all in the mind. Instead, it revealed that perception, expectation, and physiology are tightly coupled. The same biological systems that respond to medication can also respond to meaning. Healing became not only a chemical process, but a contextual one. This understanding quietly reshaped medical research. The placebo response became a standard reference point rather than an anomaly. Treatments were evaluated not only by whether they worked, but by whether they worked better than expectation alone. This raised the standard of evidence and refined the way efficacy was defined. The placebo effect also influenced clinical practice. Physicians became more aware of how communication, confidence, and environment affect outcomes. The way a treatment is presented, tone of voice, clarity, reassurance can alter patient response. Medicine, while grounded in science, remained an interpersonal exchange. Beyond healthcare, the placebo effect influenced broader thinking about belief and performance. Similar mechanisms were observed in areas such as athletic performance and cognitive function, where expectation could alter results without conscious effort. The idea that belief shapes experience gained empirical grounding. Ethically, the placebo effect introduced complexity. While deception raised concerns, the recognition that expectation has real effects encouraged exploration of transparent ways to harness it. The focus shifted from trickery to understanding how trust and meaning influence biological processes. Culturally, the concept altered how people interpreted recovery and resilience. Improvement was no longer attributed solely to external intervention. The individual became an active participant in healing, even when unaware of the mechanisms involved. The placebo effect did not overturn medicine or replace pharmacology. Its influence was subtler. It expanded the framework of healing to include cognition and context. It revealed that the body responds not only to substances, but to symbols, rituals, and expectations embedded in care. Over time, the placebo effect became so integrated into medical thinking that it faded from attention. Yet its implications remain profound. It showed that the human organism is not a passive recipient of treatment, but a responsive system shaped by belief. The placebo effect did not promise cures without medicine. It offered something quieter and more enduring, evidence that meaning itself can alter biology. By uncovering the physiological power of expectation, it reshaped how healing is understood, not as a purely mechanical process, but as a dialogue between mind, body, and belief. Information theory. For most of human history, information was treated as an abstract concept rather than a physical one. Messages were spoken, written, or remembered, but rarely analyzed as measurable entities. Communication was understood through meaning and language, not through structure or quantity. As technology advanced and communication systems grew more complex, this intuitive understanding became insufficient. Information theory quietly transformed information from an idea into a measurable, manageable resource. The foundations of information theory were established in the mid-20th century, during a period when communication technologies were rapidly expanding. Telegraphs, telephones, and early computing systems required reliable transmission of signals over noisy channels. Engineers faced a practical problem: how to transmit messages accurately despite interference, distortion, and loss. Solving this problem demanded a new way of thinking about communication itself. Claude Shannon provided that framework in 1948 with his groundbreaking work on communication systems. Rather than focusing on what messages meant, Shannon focused on how they were structured and transmitted. He introduced the idea that information could be quantified independently of content. Letters, sounds, and images could all be reduced to symbols governed by probability. At the heart of information theory was the concept of entropy, a measure of uncertainty or unpredictability in a message. High-entropy messages contained more information because they were less predictable. This insight allowed engineers to determine how much information a system could transmit and how efficiently it could do so. Communication became a problem of optimization rather than interpretation. One of the most profound implications of information theory was the realization that noise was not merely an obstacle, but a factor that could be modeled and managed. By understanding the statistical properties of noise, systems could be designed to detect and correct errors. Reliable communication no longer depended on perfect conditions, but on mathematical resilience. This shift had far-reaching consequences. Data compression techniques emerged, allowing large amounts of information to be stored and transmitted using fewer resources. Redundancy could be minimized without sacrificing accuracy. What once required physical space and time could now be reduced to efficient streams of symbols. Information theory also influenced the development of digital computing. Binary systems, error correction codes, and data storage methods all relied on its principles. The abstraction of information from meaning made it possible to process text, sound, and images using the same underlying logic. Different forms of content became interchangeable at a structural level. Beyond engineering, information theory quietly reshaped scientific thinking. Biology adopted informational concepts to describe genetic sequences, treating DNA as encoded instruction rather than mere chemistry. Neuroscience began to analyze perception and cognition in terms of signal processing. Systems were no longer just physical, they were informational. The theory also altered how communication itself was understood. Meaning became something layered on top of transmission, not embedded within it. A message could be perfectly transmitted even if it was meaningless to the receiver. This separation clarified the limits of technology and the role of interpretation. Information theory influenced economics and social systems as well. Markets, networks, and organizations could be examined through flows of information rather than only material exchange. Efficiency, coordination, and decision-making became linked to how information moved and how uncertainty was reduced. Importantly, information theory did not attempt to explain truth, value, or understanding. Its power lay in its restraint. By deliberately ignoring meaning, it achieved universality. This neutrality allowed it to apply across disciplines without conflict. Over time, the theory became so embedded in modern life that its presence became invisible. Every digital message, streamed video, stored file, and transmitted signal relies on its principles. The world became increasingly connected not by shared meaning, but by shared structure. Perhaps the most subtle influence of information theory was conceptual. It reframed information as a fundamental component of reality, alongside matter and energy. Systems could be described by how much they knew, how much they transmitted, and how much uncertainty they reduced. Information theory did not announce itself as a philosophy or worldview. It entered quietly through equations and engineering problems. Yet it reshaped civilization by making information precise, transferable, and scalable. By turning communication into a science of limits and possibilities, information theory laid the foundation for the digital age. It revealed that beneath language, images, and sound lies a deeper order, one governed not by meaning, but by structure. The theory of cognitive biases. For centuries, human reasoning was assumed to be fundamentally rational. Errors in judgment were often attributed to lack of information, poor education, or emotional interference. The mind itself was considered a reliable tool, capable of objective analysis when properly informed. The theory of cognitive biases quietly challenged this confidence by suggesting that systematic errors are not exceptions to human thinking, but built-in features of it. The foundations of this theory emerged in the mid-20th century, as psychologists began to study how people actually make decisions rather than how they are expected to make them. Traditional economic and philosophical models assumed ideal reasoning, where individuals weigh all options logically and choose the best outcome. Experimental evidence, however, painted a different picture. Even in controlled settings, people consistently deviated from rational models in predictable ways. Researchers discovered that these deviations were not random mistakes. They followed clear patterns. Individuals relied on mental shortcuts or heuristics to process information quickly and efficiently. These shortcuts were not flaws in themselves. They allowed rapid decision-making in complex environments. However, they also introduced distortions in perception, memory, and judgment. Cognitive biases emerged from these shortcuts. People tended to favor information that confirmed existing beliefs, overestimate the importance of recent or vivid events, and misjudge probabilities based on how easily examples came to mind. Such tendencies persisted even when individuals were aware of them. Knowledge alone did not eliminate bias. The theory proposed that biases are deeply rooted in the structure of cognition. The human brain evolved to make fast, adaptive decisions under uncertainty, not to perform perfect logical analysis. In environments where information was limited and time was scarce, these biases increased survival. In modern contexts, however, they could lead to systematic error. The influence of this theory expanded gradually. Economists began to incorporate cognitive biases into models of decision-making, revealing why markets do not always behave rationally. Legal scholars examined how bias affects judgment, memory, and testimony. Policymakers recognized that public behavior could not be guided by information alone. One of the most significant contributions of the theory of cognitive biases was the separation between confidence and accuracy. People often felt certain about judgments that were demonstrably flawed. This insight undermined the assumption that self-awareness guarantees correctness. Introspection proved unreliable as a safeguard against error. The theory also reshaped scientific methodology. Researchers became more cautious about interpretation, acknowledging their own susceptibility to bias. Experimental designs incorporated controls to reduce subjective influence. Objectivity became something to be constructed rather than assumed. Beyond academia, the concept of cognitive bias entered everyday language. Terms describing specific biases became common references in discussions about media, politics, and personal decision-making. Behavior once labeled as irrational gained explanation without moral judgment. Importantly, the theory did not suggest that rational thought is impossible. Instead, it clarified its limits. Human reasoning was shown to be context-dependent, shaped by framing, expectation, and cognitive load. Rationality became a spectrum rather than a standard. The theory of cognitive biases also influenced education and training. Rather than simply teaching rules, effective instruction began to address common mental pitfalls. Awareness became a tool for mitigation rather than elimination. The broader impact of this theory was philosophical. It challenged the idea of the mind as a neutral observer. Perception itself became selective and interpretive. Knowledge was filtered through cognitive structure before reaching awareness. This shift encouraged humility. If error is structural rather than accidental, certainty must be treated with caution. Decisions require not only information, but reflection on how that information is processed. The theory of cognitive biases did not arrive with sweeping declarations. It accumulated through experiments, data, and repeated observation. Its influence grew as its explanations consistently matched human behavior. By revealing the predictable ways in which the mind distorts reality, the theory quietly reshaped how judgment, choice, and belief are understood. It showed that understanding human error is not about correcting mistakes, but about recognizing the architecture that produces them. The Malthusian Theory. At the end of the 18th century, optimism about human progress was growing. Advances in agriculture, industry, and trade suggested that societies were on a steady path toward improvement. Many thinkers believed that resources and human ingenuity would expand together without meaningful limits. Against this hopeful backdrop, the Malthusian theory introduced a quiet but unsettling counterpoint. Population growth, if unchecked, would inevitably outpace the resources needed to sustain it. Thomas Robert Malthus, an English scholar, formulated this theory in 1798 while examining demographic trends. He observed that human populations tend to grow exponentially, while food production increases at a much slower, linear rate. This imbalance, he argued, created natural limits to growth. When population exceeds available resources, corrective forces emerge in the form of famine, disease, and social stress. The theory did not frame these outcomes as moral failures or political mistakes. Instead, Malthus presented them as natural consequences of biological and economic pressures. Growth itself became the problem, not mismanagement alone. This perspective shifted discussion away from short-term solutions toward structural constraints. The Malthusian theory was controversial from the outset. Its implications were uncomfortable, suggesting that progress carried built-in limits. Yet its influence spread quietly through economics, sociology, and public policy. It introduced the idea that systems could collapse not through sudden catastrophe, but through gradual imbalance. One of the theory's most lasting contributions was the concept of carrying capacity. The maximum population an environment can sustain over time. This idea encouraged a more analytical view of resource distribution, emphasizing long-term stability rather than immediate expansion. The theory also altered how poverty was understood. Instead of attributing hardship solely to individual failure or poor governance, Malthus highlighted population pressure as a contributing factor. This reframing influenced debates about welfare, labor, and social responsibility. Over time, the Malthusian framework extended beyond food supply. It was applied to land use, energy consumption, and environmental degradation. Growth became something to be evaluated rather than assumed beneficial. The idea that limits exist, even in expanding systems, gained intellectual legitimacy. The theory's influence was subtle but persistent. It shaped early demographic studies and encouraged governments to collect population data systematically. Understanding population dynamics became essential for planning rather than an afterthought. Importantly, the Malthusian theory did not claim that collapse was inevitable or immediate. It described tendencies rather than predictions. Human innovation could delay or alter outcomes, but it could not eliminate the underlying pressure created by growth. This balance between constraint and adaptability made the theory durable. It resisted simple dismissal because it addressed patterns rather than events. Even critics engaged with its logic, refining or reinterpreting its assumptions. The theory also influenced evolutionary thinking by emphasizing competition for limited resources. Population pressure became a key factor in understanding survival and adaptation. The idea that scarcity shapes outcomes extended beyond economics into biology and ecology. Culturally, the Malthusian theory introduced a sobering perspective on progress. Advancement was no longer seen as unlimited by default. Responsibility, planning, and restraint gained importance alongside innovation. The Malthusian framework did not demand specific policies or solutions. Its power lay in posing a structural question: how growth interacts with limitation. This question continued to resonate as societies expanded and resources became increasingly interconnected. Over time, the theory became embedded in discussions of sustainability and long-term planning. While specific predictions were debated, the core insight endured. Systems that grow without regard for limits invite instability. The Malthusian theory did not announce a crisis. It offered a lens through which to view gradual pressure and delayed consequence. By introducing the idea that abundance can generate scarcity, it quietly reshaped how humanity understands growth, resources, and survival. The simulation hypothesis. For most of human history, reality was assumed to be fundamentally direct and self-evident. The world existed as it appeared, governed by physical laws that could be discovered but not questioned at their foundation. Even as science revealed invisible forces and abstract dimensions, the assumption remained that reality itself was not an imitation of something else. The simulation hypothesis quietly unsettled this assumption by proposing that the universe might be an artificial construct rather than a base reality. The intellectual roots of the simulation hypothesis stretch back to philosophical skepticism. Thinkers have long questioned whether human perception provides direct access to reality or merely a representation of it. However, these questions remained abstract until advances in computation offered a new frame of reference. As digital simulations became increasingly sophisticated, the idea that complex worlds could be generated artificially no longer belonged solely to fiction. The modern formulation of the simulation hypothesis emerged from the intersection of philosophy, physics, and computer science. It suggested that a sufficiently advanced civilization could create detailed simulations of conscious beings. If such simulations were possible and common, then statistically, a randomly chosen conscious observer would be more likely to exist inside a simulation than in the original reality. This reasoning did not depend on imagery or narrative. It relied on probability and technological extrapolation. As computing power increased and virtual environments grew more detailed, the gap between simulated experience and physical experience appeared to narrow. The hypothesis did not claim certainty. It presented a conditional argument based on plausible development. What made the simulation hypothesis quietly influential was its compatibility with existing scientific frameworks. It did not require new physical laws or supernatural intervention. The universe could behave exactly as observed while still being simulated. Every measurement, constant, and interaction would remain internally consistent, regardless of the underlying substrate. The hypothesis also resonated with unresolved questions in physics. Certain limits in measurement, discrete units of space and time, and apparent constraints on information density could be interpreted as features of an underlying computational structure. These interpretations did not replace established theories, but offered an alternative lens through which to view them. Importantly, the simulation hypothesis did not suggest deception in a moral sense. It described a structural possibility rather than an intentional illusion. The simulated environment would be real to its inhabitants, regardless of its origin. Conscious experience, under this view, retains its significance even if the universe is artificial. The cultural influence of the hypothesis grew gradually. It entered public awareness not as a doctrine, but as a thought experiment. Its appeal lay in its restraint. It did not predict catastrophe or revelation. It simply reframed an ancient question using modern tools. What is the nature of reality? Philosophically, the simulation hypothesis shifted attention from substance to structure. Reality became defined less by what it is made of and more by how it operates. If experiences follow consistent rules and generate coherent outcomes, their origin becomes secondary to their function. The hypothesis also influenced discussions of consciousness. If minds can exist within simulated environments, then consciousness may not depend on specific physical materials. This idea encouraged exploration of cognition as a pattern rather than a substance, aligning with computational and informational models of mind. Critically, the simulation hypothesis did not undermine scientific inquiry. Observations remain meaningful because the internal logic of the system remains stable. Experiments still yield reliable results. Science continues to describe how reality behaves, even if the ultimate reason for its existence lies elsewhere. The hypothesis introduced a subtle form of existential humility. Human civilization became one possible layer in a larger hierarchy of creators and created systems. This did not diminish human experience. It contextualized it within a broader framework of possibility. Over time, the simulation hypothesis became a reference point rather than a conclusion. It influenced debates about technology, reality, and identity without demanding belief. Its strength lay in its coherence rather than its certainty. The simulation hypothesis did not claim that the universe is a simulation. It suggested that it could be. That conditional stance allowed it to persist without conflict, existing alongside traditional metaphysical views. By treating reality as potentially constructed yet internally consistent, the simulation hypothesis quietly expanded the boundaries of philosophical and scientific imagination. It reframed existence not as a final answer, but as a system whose origin may lie beyond observation, while remaining fully real to those who experience it. Ending. These theories did not arrive as loud revolutions or sudden revelations. They shaped the world quietly, through time, evidence, and gradual understanding. Together, they remind us that the most powerful ideas often work beneath the surface, influencing how we think, decide, and perceive reality itself. If you found this journey meaningful, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Share your thoughts in the comments. Which theory do you think had the deepest influence, and why? And if this story made you reflect, consider sharing it with a friend who enjoys thoughtful science and quiet ideas that shape the world.